This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include political consultant Doug Raymond from the eastern part of the state, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, and political consultant Brad Crone. Well, the votes have been cast and counted, and we've got a great panel to help us understand who won and why, so let's get started. In the closing days of this past election, we saw most of the candidates coming into North Carolina to make their cases, and judging by early voting, there was great interest at the top of the ticket. Some 700,000 cast early ballots, about 11% of those registered to vote. Brad, I know you watched carefully who was voting. Were you surprised by the turnout, and what can you tell us about who voted?
Well, I think the turnout was pretty much on par with what we were anticipating. The high watermark, of course, was in 2008, where you had right at 40% turnout. Turnout this election cycle was on par with 2012 at 36%. The people who turned out, I was somewhat shocked. To be honest, as we were doing models last week on the bond referendum, we anticipated a little bit bigger surge on the Republican side, and we did not see that anomaly. It was pretty much straightforward. Republicans did perform very...
Any section of the state that voted any heavier than the other?
Well, your metropolitan counties, your 5 major metropolitan counties had higher turnout percentage-wise, surrounded by your suburban counties, and then moderate to average turnout in the eastern and western part of the state.
Doug, when we were talking about this last week in our election predictions, so to speak, we indicated that the odds-on favorite to win the presidential primaries were Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Were you surprised at these outcomes, the way they turned out here in North Carolina, either the Democrats or Republicans?
Not who was at the top, maybe the margins. I think Trump and Cruz was a little bit closer. I was surprised also the amount of time that Hillary Clinton spent in the state leading up to the election, not just her, but her husband, Chelsea, were all here when the polls and even the outcome indicated that she was in good shape. I'm going to tell you, it's not scientific, but I actually worked polls on Election Day. I have never seen leading up to it and at the polls more people saying they were going into the polls on a presidential race on the Republican side undecided.
Really?
With everything that's happened, how could you not? But many people were telling me they were literally walking in the polls and they were undecided.
Chris, were you a little bit surprised by Ted Cruz's strength? I mean, Trump, last week we were thinking that Trump was going to win by double digits. Cruz came within 3 percentage points of it.
Yeah, he did, and I think that was closer than the polls had showed, although I do think when we were first analyzing the race even a few weeks ago, we probably thought Marco Rubio was going to do better. We probably thought we didn't know if other candidates would still be in the race and be actively campaigning, but it actually played out similarly around the country with the exception of Florida, which is a big exception for Trump, but all the other races that night, the election night, were fairly close.
John, everybody's saying as a result of last Tuesday night's election, the table is set for Hillary Clinton to win the Democratic nomination, Donald Trump to win the Republican nomination. Do you agree with that?
I think half of that table is set with the dessert tray and everything. I don't think on the Republican side Trump is entirely finished in the sense that he hasn't clinched the nomination. Part of what's going to happen is because the field is further winnowed, there are opportunities for Ted Cruz, and he really is the only challenger that counts at this point, for Ted Cruz to defeat Trump in a few subsequent contests. Utah most certainly, maybe Arizona, outside chance, get to Wisconsin, some other places. If you do the math and you imagine a scenario that's not implausible, you could get Trump to within 150 points or so, 150 delegates of what he needs, but not enough, throwing it into a potential contested convention. That's the scenario. It's not the most likely outcome, but this probability is not zero.
Tom, the most interesting thing about the Republican primary to me is the thought process of the Republican primary voters and how do they think that Ted Cruz will translate into a national candidate to bring moderate centrist voters to the table? And I just don't see it.
And beat Hillary Clinton.
Absolutely.
All right, Doug, there was a lot of discussion about moving the primaries to March. The legislators felt like it would make us a player in North Carolina in the nomination process. Obviously, most of the attention was devoted to Ohio and Florida, winner-take-all states. Were we, in fact, a factor in this nomination process?
Yes, we were a factor. Now, if you really wanted to be a player and as big a player as possible, if we would have had a winner-take-all state, we would have been a much bigger player in this. And, you know, that's the only caveat. I think we were a factor, but we could have been an even greater factor if we were winner-take-all.
Chris, this is the first time voter ID was actually put in effect in North Carolina. Any instances, any widespread instances where this was a problem?
I don't know if there were widespread instances. There was some reports of precincts that had been moved, wrong information on some county board of elections, not state board of elections website. So I think we're still hearing reports. I think it's too early to tell.
Brad, I want to get into the individual candidates, but I've got to talk about the Connect NC bonds. And as a disclosure, we have to say that you were one of the campaign co-managers of that Connect NC bond campaign. Were you surprised by the fact that it won 65% of the vote?
Well, our internal numbers were showing it actually a little bit higher, right at 66%. You know, Tom, we talked early in the week, and I kept telling you on Monday, 60-40, I'd be extremely happy with. So I was very happy that we overperformed. But part of that overperformance came from Trump voters on the Republican side. And the success of the bond, Democrats had long locked into the bond. They were supporting it. 74% of likely Democrats were supporting it. The Trump voters were movers. And what we did in the ad campaign, we actually moved soft Republican voters to come over and support it. Oh. And that helped put us at 66%.
Now, filing period opened for congressional primaries that are going to be held June 7th this past week and goes until March 25th. But I want to talk about the U.S. Senate primary, particularly for Republican and Democrat races. Richard Burr won as expected. The Republican nomination got 61% of the vote. Greg Brannon, 25%. Well, you're a little surprised Brannon did not do as well as he did because he gave Tillis a good, strong run last time.
Well, but the situation is completely different. Tillis was not the incumbent U.S. Senator. He was the Speaker of the House in North Carolina. He was sort of known, but not that much. So running stronger against Tillis doesn't tell you very much about what's going to happen when you run against Richard Burr. Again, not the most well-known incumbent either, though he's been in office.
Yeah, he only got 60% of the vote.
I would say that was a solid but not overwhelming win for Burr. And he's going to move into what everybody expected to be a competitive race with the Democratic nominee.
And Chris, Deborah Ross was the hand-picked candidate for the Democrats and had all kinds of official Democratic support. She got 62%. Chris Ray, the mayor of Holly Springs, we had expected to run a good stiff campaign against. He only got 16%. Were you surprised at that outcome?
I thought she overperformed, actually. I think it was clear that she was going to be the nominee, but I think she was on television. She raised a significant amount of money. I think that is reassuring to some of the folks in Washington who want to see whether or not they should invest in this race, and I think they will. And I think it'll be a very competitive Senate race.
Yeah, Tom, look at it this way. You have both races where you had 4 people on the ballot. She actually got 1% more vote than the sitting United States Senator Richard Burr. That was a surprise to me when you look at them in comparison.
Are we sort of in agreement that the outcomes in November, all the way down the ballot, may have a lot of impact on who the nominees happen to be?
The presidential race is going to determine our U.S. Senator and our gubernatorial candidates.
So we may have another 2008 situation, for instance, where Liddy Dole got thrown out.
You have a tide, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest fear factor that Burr has got to have. And Burr has
Governor McCrory.
Absolutely. Burr has a significant money advantage, and he's going to have to use it to stem that tide.
And that's important. If Trump is the nominee, then Republicans, if they're going to succeed, they're going to have to clearly differentiate themselves from him.
But they all have said so far, including Senator Burr, they will support the Republican nominee even if it is Donald Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how they do that.
You're right. The first thing to watch for is how many of them just have scheduling conflicts and nowhere near events.
The only thing that I would interject is I definitely think it's a factor, but I give the voters a little bit more credit. I don't care who's at the top of the ticket. I think on important races, particularly the governor's race, they're going to make their own decision.
We've seen it before. And Bev Perdue and Pat McCrory can talk to you about what happened in 2008. We thank you for watching NC Spin either over the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. After these messages, we're going to go down the ballot and analyze the election returns.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
We now return to NC Spin.
We want to look down the individual races down the ballot. And Chris, as a result of the court decision regarding congressional redistricting, the legislature decided to do away with runoffs or second primary elections. Were there instances where this might have affected the outcomes?
There were a handful of legislative races where this was a factor, primarily in places where there wasn't an incumbent. There wasn't a clear favorite. There were 3 or 4 people. I think the Davidson County Senate race, which we'll talk about, for example, there were several candidates, none of whom got 50%, some who didn't even get 40%, and one candidate would win. So it did have not an overwhelming impact, not an overwhelming number of races, but it did factor in a few races across the state.
And Tom, people had expected it to have affected some of the statewide primaries for Council of State, like the State Superintendent of Public Instruction or Insurance Commissioner on the Republican side, Lieutenant Governor on the Democratic side. It had no effect on any of those races.
Yeah.
All those winners got above 40%.
Good point. So going into Tuesday's vote, I want to look at the races for governor now. It was expected incumbent Pat McCrory would win for the Republicans. Roy Cooper would capture the Democratic nomination. Were you surprised by outcomes on that, John?
No. McCrory won overwhelmingly.
80%.
And the concern was that he might suffer in the Charlotte area on the I-77 toll. He really didn't, but I tell you where he did get the lowest number was in Iredell County, which is north of Mecklenburg. That's where a lot of the real opposition to I-77 toll road is. And he got his lowest number. He still won the vast majority of the votes, but he got a much lower number in Iredell than anywhere else. And that was the home county of his challenger, Robert Brawley.
Yeah, Brad, were you a little bit surprised Roy Cooper got 69% and Ken Spalding got 31%? Spalding had no money, no statewide name recognition, and still got 31% of the vote?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of that was from African-American political action committees across the state who made sure that they worked with the minority candidate. And the Spaldings, Ken's very well respected here in the Triangle and especially over in his home county in Durham. I think he had an important voice for the party. I think it's imperative that the Democrats go to Ken and make a place for him in the coordinated campaign.
Yeah. All right. Doug, there was a lot of excitement in the nomination for Lieutenant Governor. Obviously, incumbent Dan Forrest didn't have any opposition. The Democrats had 4 candidates running: Holly Jones, Linda Coleman, Robert L. Wilson, Earl Wilson, and Ron Newton. Linda Coleman, second time running for Lieutenant Governor, won the race, 51%, as John was saying. Any surprise?
I just think that's a very strong number for that type of race with that many people in it. And you got to remember, you know, Dan Forrest, she had a very, very close race against Dan Forrest, so we've got a rematch that's definitely going to be worth watching.
All right, moving on down the line, we talked about in last week's show perhaps the 2 most important statewide races, not discounting anybody else, were the state treasurers and the attorney general race. So let's look at them. On the Democratic side, Chris, for Attorney General Josh Stein was running against Marcus Williams. Stein would only beat him by 6%. Were you a little surprised at how strong Williams showed up?
I was a little surprised, but I think, he's running against an African-American lawyer, Marcus Williams, who's run many times before. I don't know how much Senator Stein spent in some of the areas. There are some reports that he wasn't as heavy in the media markets outside the triangle. He clearly has some work to do, I think, to get his name out there, but I still think he's a strong candidate in the fall.
All right. And Doug, I have to pay homage to you and at the same time acknowledge the fact that you were running Buck Newton's campaign for Attorney General.
I didn't do that good a job. You can't remember his name, so my name ID must not have been strong.
You know, I don't know why I drew a blank. I've known his parents for years, and anyway. Buck won 55-45. I think that was a bigger spread than a lot of the pundits had thought would be happening. What was your reaction and Buck's reaction to this?
Obviously, the reaction was good, and I appreciate your kind words, but it's about the candidate, and Buck was an excellent candidate. And in a race like this, where we knew going in there was going to be a lot more exciting things happening at the top of the ticket, Buck put in the hard work, put in the miles doing it, and we had a great grassroots network that I hope is going to transfer over to Newton. But the praise goes to Buck, not to me.
John, the state treasurer's race, Republican Dale Falwell is running unopposed. All of this, of course, is predicated on the fact Janet Cowell has decided not to run again. Dale Falwell is running for Republicans unopposed. Ron Elmer and Dan Blue on the Democratic side. Elmer had run before. This is the first time Dan Blue III's name was on a statewide ballot, and he captured 58% of the vote to Elmer's 42%. Were you a little surprised at that?
Well, he had an obvious asset. We all know what it is. He was a panelist on NC Spin, and that's what clearly gave him the edge. It might have also helped that he has the same name as his father, who has been a prominent North Carolina politician for decades.
And himself had been on statewide ballots.
And I think that helped a lot. But also, Ron Elmer did have support from the State Employees Association. They worked that race very, very hard. But I suspect a lot of people just didn't follow the race very closely, didn't know a lot about it. Dan Blue's name was more familiar, and he had campaigned effectively.
Brad, on the Secretary of State's race, of course, Elaine Marshall didn't have any opposition on the Democratic side, but we had two Republicans, A.J. Dowd and Mike LaPaglia, running there. Dowd's been on the ballot before, and yet he lost this to LaPaglia 62-38. Was that a little bit of a surprise?
Well, I think that it was, again, a lesser-known race. There wasn't a whole lot of money. But I understand LaPaglia went out across the state promising new leadership and new direction, and I think that was something voters wanted to buy.
Tom, for that, a down ballot race, that's a huge number, especially against somebody who's run before, and even, we're just talking frank, I mean, even a name, you wouldn't consider that a big North Carolina name, LaPaglia. I mean, 62% in a down ballot race like that, that's a huge number. That was very surprising.
All right, Chris, over on the Superintendent of Public Instruction's race, June Atkinson won very handily, 80% against Henry Pankey. There were three Republicans running there, Mark Johnson, Rosemary Stein, and Wesley Sills. Johnson got 53%, Stein got 33%.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by that, but I'm obviously not as in touch with the Republican primary electorate as maybe some other folks. But Stein has sort of ran, I think, as the more conservative candidate, more strongly against Common Core and some other things. The winner, as a member of the Forsyth County Board of Education, obviously has an urban base. I wasn't necessarily surprised he won. I was surprised. I thought that in the margin he won by, I thought it would be a lot closer.
All right, in the Commissioner of Insurance race, incumbent Commissioner Democrat Wayne Goodwin didn't have any opposition. The Republicans had Mike Causey, who has run several times before, Joe McLaughlin, and Ron Pierce. Causey just eked out a victory there, 41% to 33% over McLaughlin.
And I think that's name ID and recognition with base Republican voters across the state. And it'll be interesting to see. You got to give the edge to Wayne Goodwin going into the general election. Strong retail politician, strong name ID.
And Charles Meeker, first time on a statewide ballot, former mayor of Raleigh, beat Maisie Ferguson in the Commissioner of Labor's race. Did that surprise anyone?
Not at all.
No. Not at all. All right. After these messages, we're going to come back and talk about legislative races. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump. I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at ournchealthcare.com.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our recap of last Tuesday's primary elections. We had legislative primaries as well as local elections, and I want to ask our panelists to comment on some of the more interesting ones. John, you've been watching the races in the Charlotte metro area and the western part of the state. Tell us about the outcomes in some of these races that were interesting.
Well, let's start in the Charlotte area. There were two House competitive primaries I was watching, one on the Democratic side, one on the Republican side. The Democratic race was House 100. John Autry, he's a member of the Charlotte City Council. He won 53% of the vote against an opponent who had also been on the Charlotte City Council. He's going to be elected to November. Scott Stone in House 105 won that Republican primary to replace Jackie Schaefer.
The Schaefer seat, yeah.
And he won that by 52%. And the interesting thing about Scott Stone and several other races is, as far as I can tell, in almost every race where an incumbent legislator was leaving and then turned around and endorsed, that endorsee won. So the notion that, well, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and, you know, Republican voters want to throw all the bums out, no, they don't. They pretty much liked incumbents or people that incumbents liked. Yeah. It's just something to remember. Let me mention a couple of races. There's a Senate race near Charlotte. Fletcher Hartzell in Senate District 36 was stepping down. There were 4 candidates in that race. This was one of those races that would have gone to a runoff if we had a runoff rule, but the winner was Paul Newton with 37% of the vote. And what's interesting about that, he's strongly supported by the chamber. Not surprisingly, he used to be on the board. He was the state president for Duke Energy, and is going to be an important player in the Senate very quickly. 2 Senate races in the northwestern part of the state worth mentioning. One of them is, in the western part of the state, one of them is Deanna Ballard up in the northwest, District 45. She was endorsed by outgoing Senator Dan Suchek, and she won that race, 53% of the vote. And similarly, over in the western part of the state, Tom Apodaca, powerful state senator, was stepping down. It was a crowded primary, 3 candidates on the Republican side to replace him. Apodaca endorsed a businessman, Chuck Edwards, over Lisa Baldwin, who's a conservative activist, former school board member in Buncombe County, and Chuck Edwards won that race fairly easily.
All right, Chris, let's go to the central and Piedmont part of the state, because you've been watching a lot of those races, and I got to lead off with the Senate District 16 in Wake County, the Ellis Hankin Jay Chadry race. Were you at all surprised that Chadry just really decisively beat Ellis Hankin?
I was not surprised Chadry won, but I was very surprised at the margin that he won, almost 60% of the vote. And that's one that Democrats are closely watching. It's overwhelming Democratic district. So Jay Chaudhry is most likely going to be a senator in the fall. Couple other Wake County races, one did not materialize much. Rosa Gill, who's running for re-election, she had two challengers, one of whom Bernard Allen, the second, won easily. Yeah. His father was a prominent politician in Wake County. House District 36, Nelson Dollar, the House Republican Party House Budget Chair, Mark Vallee. I think a lot of people thought that was going to be very close, and it wasn't a rout, but Nelson Dollar won comfortably. The primary in the Democratic side, Jennifer Farrell and Woody Cleary, was not close. Jennifer Farrell, and I think she'll be a strong Democratic candidate in the fall. If it's at all a Democratic year, I think she has a strong chance.
All right.
A couple other races in the Piedmont. Senator Stan Bingham's leaving. That was an open seat. That was one of those where would have been conceivably affected by a runoff. Kathy Dunn won over Joe D. Kennedy and Eddie Gallimore, who has run many times. Representative Leo Daughtry is leaving. That race was won by Donna McDowell White, beat Dennis Nielsen, who's run many times, and one more. In Cumberland County, incumbent Senator Ben Clark, an African-American, was expected to have some trouble, and he did. He won, but two Democratic challengers, the closest of which was Naveed Aziz, who's actually a physician, a Pakistani woman. She came close, but Senator Ben Clark will go back.
All right, we'll have more legislative races after these messages.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
We continue our wrap-up of last Tuesday's elections. We were talking about legislative races, and one of them was House District 87. Destin Hall, which was a candidate that you represented, defeated George Robinson, an incumbent.
That's right, and I'm old enough to be, and he's young enough to be really proud. He's 28 years old, wasn't recruited by anybody, contacted me back in November and said, hey, I want to run for this race, and just absolutely worked his tail off, and is really a feel-good story.
All right, and there was another incumbent that...
Amos Quick, a school board member in Guilford County, beat incumbent Ralph Johnson, who passed away on Election Day 2. He was not actively campaigning, had a stroke, and was in poor health.
And so far as the rest of it, incumbents won, not a big problem there. No really close races in some of the contests that we talked about last week.
There were a few close races. Charles Jeter in the Charlotte area won by just a handful of votes, a couple of dozen votes.
28 votes.
Yeah.
And the North Carolina House District 6 Republican primary there was relatively close, and that's going to be a race to watch.
All right, well, you've heard our spin on last Tuesday's elections. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Next week, we return to our regular format of balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.